1966 when he and 2 other Army privates refused a direct order to serve in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Many people who are 19 and 20 really don't understand the significance of this, but this really marked the beginning of resistance to the war from inside the military. And he and his comrades were thereafter known as the Fort Hood Three and served 28 months in Leavenworth for their action. He worked as a labor journalist for 27 years until his recent retirement in 2012. He was first at AFSCME District Council 1707, then Communications Director of SEIU Local 144, and finally the editor of 1199's official publication. He has worked actively on climate issues inside SEIU for many years, and he continues to do so. Michael Clare is the 5-college professor of peace and world security studies in Massachusetts. It's quite a mouthful. He has worked with many NGOs on issues of peace, disarmament, human rights, and the environment, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Arms Control Association. Professor Clare writes for The Nation, where a lot of us are familiar with his writings in The Nation. Also Tom Dispatch, he's very often appears there. Also Newsweek, Scientific American, any number of other publications. His 2 most recent books, Rising Powers, Shrinking Planet, and The Race for What's Left, are must-reads, frankly. They're very well written, and they carry essential information. And I think that they're very important for both people on the peace side and the climate side. And you can purchase both of these books tonight at our lit table, well stocked by my co-chair, Gary Goff, at the back of the room. Janet Redman, to my left, is director, I guess you're all to my left. Maybe I'm on the wrong side. Janet Redman is Director of Climate Policy at the Institute for Policy Studies in DC. She is a founding member of the Global Climate Justice Now network and works with national and international grassroots groups such as the Climate Justice Alliance, which is playing a fairly prominent role in the People's Climate March. She's worked with youth and women's groups on empowerment through community farming and sustainability here in the United States and also in Bangladesh. And on a personal note, the way Gary and I first met Janet was when we were arrested together in 2011 in front of the White House at a sit-in protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. So apparently there are a lot of good things that come out of going to jail. Sean Sweeney is co-director of the Global Labor Institute at Cornell. Sean works with the international labor community on sustainability and climate issues and has done so for many years. In 2007, Sean worked with the steelworkers and other unions to organize the North American Labor Assembly on Climate Crisis, the first major conference on unions and climate change. And you have no idea how important that is. Getting labor involved is absolutely critical. He coordinates trade unions for energy democracy, a global project that is building support for social ownership of energy, including renewable power. And of course, he has attended several of the UN conferences on the climate.
The title of the conversation tonight is Which Way Forward. I think that's assisted, or that process is assisted by understanding what happened in the last 10 or 15 years around the climate talks and also the climate movement. So I want to spend 6 or 7 minutes only just doing a little recap in the hope that that might be helpful for some people in the audience. The basic, let's start with a year ago. A year ago, or about 10 months ago, the Warsaw COP, the Conference of the Parties, ended in chaos when delegates from Australia and Canada were seen with their feet up on the table, wearing t-shirts, eating their lunch in the middle of profoundly moving testimony from often representatives and delegates from the global south. This was just after the disaster in the Philippines with Yolanda, or I can't remember the other name of it, Haiyan. And it was seen to be a real affront to the whole seriousness of the challenge. And it led to a walkout of the environmental organizations and the trade unions. And it was a really significant moment to have people who've been spending a decade or more trying to work with this system to have to walk out. And I'm going to read a quote here, and it is from Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN. He says, "What now? If governments are unwilling to lead when leadership is required, people must. We need a global grassroots movement that tackles climate change and its fallout." And if sort of fairly mainstream figures in world politics are saying that we need a people's-led climate movement, that is speaks to the seriousness of the historical period we're in and the nature of the climate challenge. But I want to just go back a little bit over the UN process over the years. Many of you know, like the Kyoto Treaty, the Kyoto Protocol. In roughly about 20 or so years ago, there was an acceptance, over 20 years, 25 years ago now, there was an acceptance that the atmosphere was getting warmer, global warming was a problem, and the scientific evidence was beginning to accumulate. There was a body called the Intergovernmental on Climate Change, which was convened by the UN to gather all of the data. And there was an acceptance that certain rich countries, what was called Annex I countries, were primarily responsible for the problem and should bear the brunt of the responsibility to pursue a solution, at least in the first phase. So a treaty was negotiated called the Kyoto Treaty, which the United States did not sign on to, which basically exempted the developing world from any emissions reductions in the short term, but put all the emphasis on the developed world that was responsible for 80–90% of the emissions that were in the atmosphere already and causing global warming. Now, I want to flash forward to 2007. As it was clear that the Kyoto Protocol was going to expire in 2012, many countries in Europe had begun to more or less meet their commitments. But bear in mind, it was a 5% reduction, and it didn't have much of an impact in the overall emissions trajectory. Meanwhile, the developing countries, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, their emissions was going up very, very quickly. So the world in which the Kyoto Treaty was negotiated was not the same world as was around 2007. But I was in the room in Bali at COP13, and the assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was basically the subject of a whole day of presentations by scientists. And there were 2,000 or 3,000 people in the room, and you could have heard a pin drop, hearing one report after other: ocean acidification, glacier melt, soil degradation, coral reef bleaching. It went on and on. And of course, typically it led to a flurry of speeches from top politicians that we have to do something about climate change. And even though there was a dire scientific scenario being laid out, it also came with some certain degree of optimism. First of all, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change offered in 2007 an emissions reductions trajectory. And it was pretty scary to look at it. It was a 50% global reductions by 2050 based on 1990 levels. Bear in mind, the levels of emissions have gone up 15% from 1990 to 2007 when we were in Bali. The other thing that came out of that process, though, was this commitment from the G8 and the G20 that they were going to reduce emissions in accordance with the science-based targets. On the other hand, there was another scientific debate going on. It says, who says that 2 degrees, or so-called 450 parts per million, was actually scientifically accurate? A lot of countries were saying 2 degrees condemns our countries, the small island nations, sub-Saharan Africa, to sorts of changes that were absolutely catastrophic. So this began to come into the debate. But generally speaking, in terms of the climate movement, which was in its infancy then, there was a sense that there was this process, the UN process, could deliver a global agreement in Copenhagen at the end of 2009. And all of the movement really, or a lot of the movement, gravitated towards that goal. So let's move forward to the 2009 COP, if I have time, Mark. Martha. I'm not sure who's keeping time, me probably. Yeah, I know. So in 2009, expectations were high, but if you read between the lines, you knew that something was wrong. Obama had been elected, and he said, we are going to engage the UN talks in a robust way. That didn't mean to say the administration was going to support an agreement, just means they were going to engage in the talks in a robust way, for what that was worth. Then you had the Stern Review. The Stern Review came out in 2006, which was called The Economics of Climate Change, and said, this is a piece of cake. Reducing emissions by this level is totally doable. We have the technology that can solve this problem. And Stern was extremely confident that this was going to happen. It was also a time when the recession was beginning to hit, and there's a sense that the sort of the more liberal wing of the capitalist elite was in the ascendancy. You had Rudd, elected Prime Minister in Australia, saying a new era of social democracy is going to be born, and this time it's going to be green. So you had a lot of optimism. But in Copenhagen, all that optimism came to naught. We saw Hillary fly in, followed by Obama. They did a deal, which I don't have time to go into detail. Many of you will remember it. It was basically they huddled in the corner, they sabotaged the talks, and they came out with the Copenhagen Accord. The Accord basically said, and Todd Stern, the chief negotiator for the administration, was clear about this even before the talks. They said, we don't need a global agreement on emissions reductions. That's not possible. There are just a few emitters who add up to 80% of the emissions, and they have to get together and do what they can in a pledge and review system. We make a commitment, then we occasionally go back and see if we're meeting the commitment. That was 2009. It was catastrophic for the climate movement that hoped to get something out of Copenhagen. So here we are. The next 3 years of the Conference of the Parties around the UN produced pretty much nothing. Blah, blah, blah for 3 years, all talking about, do we need an agreement, do we not need an agreement? And then you get to a point where you had the walkout in Warsaw, which I began my comments with. So this is the kind of context. And so when Ban Ki-moon decides he's going to call a summit, of course he's not calling a march, he's calling a summit. And the idea is, let's put back on the agenda of world leaders climate protection, because it's fallen down the agenda. And what we're going to see in the summit on September 23rd, in my opinion, is nonsense. It's going to be a day's worth of fine speeches, and we need action. So this means that the march is absolutely important to show the world that the world is going to move on climate protection. But I don't have time to go into what a march means. We all have seen marches in the past. Some lead to major change, some are just another march and we all go home. It has to be in the context of building a robust, consistent movement that's grounded in education, in action, and in clarity. There will be debates inside that movement, how much we need to change the fundamental dynamics of capitalism. It's a system that's based on growth, profit, accumulation, and consumption. Can we have a system that's truly in alignment with nature, with that system in place? There's a lot of debate about that, and let's bring it on. Let's have that discussion. I actually don't think we can do that, but I believe that there's a new narrative emerging about defending the commons, about economic democracy, about democratic control over major economic decisions, and in that I take some hope. But a march is a march. It's going to be hugely significant, but if that's all we're going to do and then go home, it's not going to be enough, and I think everybody in this room is fully aware of that. So I just want to turn it over now to our next speaker, which I believe is you.
I was asked to talk about financialization, kind of the financialization of what's happening in the climate world. What's the role of the financial sector and the private sector, and what does that mean for how we're moving forward in the world of how we address climate, but also what does that mean for this march that's happening here? I think it's important because here we are in the heart of Wall Street in New York City. A lot is going on in this climate summit that has to do with the questions that Sean asked. Can we move forward in the capitalist model that we've got right now and solve the climate crisis? And while the negotiators that Sean talked about were going blah, 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 the financial sector has actually been organizing itself to answer that question for us. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about that. I'm not going to pick up on the kind of broad politics of negotiation, but I'm just going to lift up the financing side, because while there's one half of the conversation that's happening globally about reducing emissions, the other half of the conversation is how the heck are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it here at home? How are we going to do the things we know we need to do? Move to decentralized energy systems, move toward better food systems, deal with transportation issues, deal with the impacts of climate, and how are we going to fulfill the obligation that we have as a developed country and developed countries toward developing countries to pay a climate debt that is both morally our responsibility because we've been able to develop over the Industrial Revolution by using cheap greenhouse gas emitting energy sources, but because it's actually legally enshrined in the UN that we will repay that debt. And that debt is big. So Ban Ki-moon on his UN Climate Summit website talks about tens of billions of dollars to make this transition into a low energy, climate resilient economy. Business groups are actually calling it about $1 trillion a year at this point to make that transition globally. And developed countries have said they will pass off, they'll mobilize $100 billion a year to developing countries to enable them to move to clean energy pathways. So what's scary about that is it's huge numbers, and what's happening in the kind of global narrative is taking advantage of the urgency of the issue. Basically what we're hearing from all over the place, we're hearing about it in climate, we're hearing about it in development circles that we don't have the money, we're broke. America's broke, the developed world is broke, and so we need to get that cash from where the money is, and that's the private sector, partly because we just bailed the banks out, so they've got all that money. But partly because we need the investment sector to green itself. We need businesses to be greener, we need investors to be greener, and so we need to make sure they're right in the center of solving the climate crisis with us. And then there's of course the logic that you know, the market can do this much more efficiently. So we've got these three answers. The money is there, those folks need to green anyway, and they're the most efficient way to do it. And that's across the board, in moving to low carbon energy systems, but also, and many people say, to build a new infrastructure in a climate changed world that looks very different than the one we have today, and to repay that debt. So we're not just talking about a corporate takeover, we're talking about a financial sector takeover of this climate conversation. And it's happening, you know, it's going to be happening in 2 weeks right here at the Ban Ki-moon Summit. And the private sector and financial sector are perfectly happy to have that conversation, I think. Part of the private sector identifies the fact that, yeah, climate change does impact our bottom line, so we need to do some stuff about it. So I think genuinely, there's, you know, there's a real truth in some of the private sector actors saying we want to change and make a difference. Then there's of course the reputational risk that says when we green our portfolio, we get to keep on doing the bad stuff over here because we can just point over there and you can see how green we are, which happens in a lot of places. And then there's the fact that regulation may happen, and so they're going to have to change their portfolio anyway. So they might as well reduce their contribution now and get on the good side of that. But in the world we live in right now, along the kind of market logic, we're also kind of seeding a space that says, well, we value this. We value clean water. We value no pollution in the atmosphere. We value biodiversity. And so the best way to make that value internal to how we make decisions is to put a price tag on it. So one of the biggest conversations you're going to hear in the Ban Ki-moon Summit right now is put a price on carbon. And we're engaging some of the biggest institutions in the world to do that, like the World Bank. And in some ways that might make sense, because if we put a price on it, it's like how you pay your electricity bill. If you put a price on your electricity bill, maybe you'll keep the lights off because you won't waste as much electricity. The problem is that by putting a price on things like carbon, you make an asset out of part of nature. So now we've got a thing that actually is worth money, not just to regulate our use of it, and this is where the financial sector comes in, but now you've got a thing called a carbon credit, or a biodiversity credit, or a water credit. And now you can take that and trade it for financial gain in a whole other system. You can make derivatives out of it. You can put it on Wall Street functionally. And that's part of what the financial sector is excited about. But even before you do, even besides that giant scary piece of the picture, you know, we've got a conversation right now, again, the narrative of we're broke, we need the money, we need to entice the private sector to be a part of problem solving here. And so we need to do anything we can to leverage, using our small amount of public money and our public institutions, and even our public laws, to entice the big pool of money that's out there, the financial sector, the laborers' pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, all the big pools of money that are circulating, reduce the risk for the private sector to invest, make it worth their while, pull in money from the equity funds, pull in money from the capital market, attract these institutional investors, and relax our rules so they can meet their interests while we meet the interests of the planet. And that's where the real problem comes in, is around this idea of regulation. And who, in fact, is writing the rules around climate if the focus of our task is to make sure that climate action is most attractive to the financial sector. So again, this idea of financialization of the rules is the key piece, I think, in trying to answer the question that Sean laid out. It's the worry of using public policy and public institutions to make it as attractive as possible for the financial sector to either green their own investments or for the private sector to green its business practices. So it's designing laws to create economic opportunity for green growth, as opposed to talking about what's the public need and how do we reduce emissions while we adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change. And another way, it's talking about how do we make it as cheap as possible for the private sector to obey the law. So we've got examples of that everywhere. That's like the European emissions trading system, or California's new trading system that says, listen, we know we need to have power plants reduce their emissions, but it's going to be hard. Economically, we don't want to crash our economy either. How can we make sure it's as easy as possible, as cheap as possible, even if it means bending the rules around actually reducing emissions where they're being polluted, where they're being released, even if it means buying someone else's land somewhere else, reducing emissions there and counting them as our own, even if it means that leads to grabbing someone else's land, potentially violating their human rights and calling those our own emissions. So these are the kinds of problems that we see when we start financializing the responsibility to take action on climate. Just to illustrate the tight relationship between financialization, the financial sector, and regulation, next week the UK is going to unveil its big climate plan before they come here. But they're going to do it at the City of London. They're doing it basically at their Wall Street. So that's the kind of connection we're talking about. We've just had, there was a big announcement that Obama made around protecting the climate and bringing energy access to Africa. It's hand in hand with GE. He was on the GE podium when he made that announcement. So we're seeing this kind of the knitting together of the financial and private sectors in the climate regime. I'm not going to belabor the point of why this is a problem. It's a problem because the financial sector makes decisions based on profit motive and not on the needs of us here in this room, certainly not on the needs of poor people in the global south, people who are marginalized by their own government, let alone not even having access to much of the sector that we're talking about. It's not an ecological stability motive. It exacerbates the ability for the financial sector to rig the rules when they're at the center of the solution to climate change. And it has incredible challenges with transparency and accountability, of course, around the board. And I'm just thinking of an example right now that we're working very hard on a new fund called the Green Climate Fund. It's supposed to be the place that actually those rich governments channel their $100 billion to developing countries, to global south. It's just adopted standards that don't meet the basic international labor standards. And that's in part because of the lobbying of the private sector and of Bank of America in that space to say, if we want the financial sector to be right in the middle of this game, we can't have strong rules. We can't have tough rules. You have to make it easy for us to play. So I just want to talk about kind of what are some of the solutions in the sense of answering the question that Sean laid out. One of the big things we can do is start pulling our money out of the financial sector. We've been advocating for a Robin Hood tax, or a financial transaction tax that actually would tax every transaction that Wall Street does. So it's starting to kind of suck some of that cash back out. We can also divest from the fossil fuel sector. So you've got the 350 Divest Campus movement. You've got philanthropies that are divesting their stock portfolios from fossil fuels. You've got wealthy individuals who are doing that. And I think you're going to see some big announcements about that on the 23rd at the Climate Summit. But then we have to think about what we're putting the money into, and that's the other side of this. I mean, we can't pretend that there's no need for cash. We need to pay for the stuff we know we need to do, like community-based energy systems, like public transportation that runs with no fossil fuel emissions. And so we need to start talking about reinvesting in a new economy, and that economy has to be place-based. It has to promote democracy. It has to talk about shared prosperity and have a new definition of what wealth means. And it has to be grounded ecologically in the reality of a climate-constrained world. So there are a whole bunch of places that you can find those examples, here in New York, everywhere. I would urge people to look at a website. It's called the Our Power Campaign. It's part of the Climate Justice Alliance national movement toward thinking about how to do local-based solutions to the climate crisis and how to finance that. So just a quick word on this idea of the Ban Ki-moon March, because I agree with Sean that it's really important for us to be here. I also am really concerned that there's no demand in this march. So right now I think it's going to be something like, hey leaders, take action. And I don't think that's good enough, actually. I think we need to be talking about demanding that we get Wall Street out of the Ban Ki-moon Summit. Right now they're set to have a private sector lunch. That's more access than anyone in civil society is getting by a long shot. There isn't even a heads of state lunch, but there's a private sector lunch. So we need to start taking back that space. And I would invite folks, if they're interested in joining an action on Wall Street on Monday after the People's Climate March. There is a convergence at Battery Park at 10 a.m. If you go to Flood Wall Street, that's hashtag Flood Wall Street, you can find information about being part of a contingent that's saying, you know, Wall Street isn't the answer to our climate problem.